In the beginning, the UFC wasn't respected. It wasn't regulated, it wasn't refined, and it definitely wasn't mainstream. It was wild, violent, raw. To some, it looked like evolution. To most, it looked like madness. There were no gloves, no rounds, no weight classes. It all came down to one simple but brutal question: who's the better fighter? But the world wasn't ready. To the media, it was savage. To politicians, it was dangerous. To traditional fight fans, it was a joke. But to a small group of early viewers, it was real. A glimpse of what happens when technique meets instinct, with nothing in between. And a man who followed that formula? Royce Gracie, the man in the gi. He didn't throw wild punches. He didn't look like a killer. He barely spoke. But in 1993, Royce stepped into that cage and submitted 3 men in one night without throwing a single punch. Boxers, wrestlers, strikers, it didn't matter. He choked them out like it was inevitable. And that changed everything. This wasn't just violence. It was skill. It was strategy. But skill didn't pay the bills. The second they got attention, they started getting shut down. U.S. Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting. Sponsors pulled out. State commissions banned it. Cable networks refused to air it. By the late 90s, the UFC was dying, losing money, losing visibility. And that's when 3 men stepped in: Frank Fertitta, Lorenzo Fertitta, and Dana White. In 2001, they bought the UFC for just $2 million. At the time, it felt like lighting money on fire. But Dana White had a vision. Not just for a sport, but for a system. Step 1. Sanitize. Add gloves, judges, doctors, rules. Get sanctioned. Get regulated. Make it look professional, not primitive. Step 2. Educate the public. Call it mixed martial arts. A discipline. A science. But even then, the fans didn't come. Not fast enough. The UFC was still bleeding money. So they took a risk. A massive one. A reality show. The Ultimate Fighter. A group of fighters. One house fighting for a UFC contract. And it almost flopped. Until the finale. Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar. 3 rounds of pure chaos. No defense, no retreat. Just 2 men swinging until they could barely stand. And the moment it ended, the phones lit up. People got it. This wasn't just violence. It was passion, sacrifice, heart. That night, the UFC was reborn. Viewership exploded. Fans poured in. The UFC had its hook and its momentum. Then it built an empire. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, the UFC didn't just grow, it boomed. George St. Pierre brought elegance and control. Anderson Silva turned knockouts into art. John Jones redefined chaos and reach. Each name became a myth. Each fight, a chapter. And then came the man who changed everything. Conor McGregor. He didn't walk, he strutted. He didn't speak, he sold. A suit, a smirk, and a deadly left hand. McGregor became the UFC's biggest star. He sold out arenas, broke pay-per-view records. He crossed into boxing. Even Hollywood. Every time he spoke, the world listened. Every time he fought, millions watched. He was a fighter, yes, but also a brand. And in 2016, the UFC cashed in. WME-IMG, one of the world's biggest entertainment companies, bought the UFC for $4.2 billion. From $2 million to $4.2 billion. By the late 2000s and 10s, the UFC wasn't just growing, it was dominating. Each year brought record-breaking events, sold-out arenas, pay-per-view numbers that made boxing promoters sweat. UFC 229, Khabib versus McGregor, pulled in 2.4 million buys, the biggest in MMA history. Las Vegas, Melbourne, New York, São Paulo, Abu Dhabi. The Octagon became a traveling stadium, a global spectacle. And the cards delivered. John Jones versus Daniel Cormier, Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor, Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington, Israel Adesanya rising fast. These weren't just fights, they were chapters in a saga, and they brought money, big money. In 2018, the UFC signed a $1.5 billion media deal with ESPN, locking in both visibility and legitimacy. By 2019, annual revenues pushed past $900 million. Merchandise, streaming rights, sponsorships, crypto deals. The UFC was no longer just selling tickets. It was printing cash. Meanwhile, the competition faded. Pride FC, once Japan's MMA crown jewel, collapsed under corruption scandals. And when it did, the UFC bought it and absorbed its stars. Wanderlei Silva, Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson, a legacy erased and reborn. Strikeforce, bought in 2011, gone. But its talent crossed over. Daniel Cormier, Ronda Rousey. They didn't just survive, they became icons. Bellator, it tried. Tournaments, aging legends, but it never found its moment or its star. One championship grew in Asia, full of spectacle and hype. but it lacked depth, no global breakout names, no pay-per-view foothold. And the UFC, it didn't just promote fights, it built stars. And it did it weekly. Fight Night, Contender Series, embedded. If Bellator was a show, the UFC became a network. While boxing's biggest names fought once or twice a year, the UFC staged nearly 45 events annually. But then just 4 years later, the world stopped. In 2020, COVID shut everything down. The NBA, the Olympics, boxing, and then MMA, a real, live contact sport. It seemed impossible, but Dana White didn't flinch. He turned the UFC Apex in Vegas into a fortress. Chartered planes, daily tests, quarantined teams, and somehow it worked. The UFC became the only show in town. No fans, no noise, just fists echoing through empty arenas. It was haunting, raw, unforgettable. While other sports paused, the UFC pressed forward. Weekly events, TV contracts fulfilled. New fans tuned in and stayed because they saw something real. But beneath it all, one truth kept it running: fighter pay. Because UFC fighters, especially the newcomers, don't earn millions. Many get $12,000 to show and $12,000 to win. That's a fraction of what boxers or NFL players make. Critics call it exploitation. The UFC calls it structure. In this system, if you want more, you fight for it. Literally, you don't talk your way to the top. Unless you're McGregor, you earn it. Every knockout moves you up. Every win matters. Every call-out, every bonus, every highlight, it counts. It's not soft. It's built on hunger, on risk, and that's why it works. While other leagues spent millions just to survive, the UFC spent less and grew. They signed a mega deal with ESPN, opened performance institutes in China and Mexico, signed fighters from Nigeria, Kyrgyzstan, New Zealand, Brazil, Russia. But while the fights were getting bloodier, the audience was getting smarter. Because something unexpected happened. The fans evolved too. At first, they came for the knockouts, but soon they stayed for the nuance. They started to recognize a southpaw stance, a check hook. They debated grappling transitions, memorized fight cards, followed weigh-ins like rituals. No other sport demands this much from its audience. But that's exactly why it works. Because UFC fans aren't passive, they're students. And the UFC gave them the curriculum: embedded, countdown, fight pass archives. It wasn't just spectacle, it was education. And the more fans learned, the deeper they fell in. Until one day, the guy watching from his couch wasn't just cheering. He was analyzing, scoring rounds, predicting game plans. He knew the difference between a guillotine and a darce. He knew how much a bad weight cut could drain a fighter. He wasn't just watching fights, he was speaking the language. And that's when the UFC became more than a league. It became a classroom, a culture, a conversation. Today, the UFC is more than a promotion. It is the fight game. If you're not in the UFC, you're not on top. Simple as that. The UFC didn't just survive, it evolved, it expanded, it took over, and somehow, it's still just getting started.